Well, I'll start with the last point you made about the tax cuts. We keep forgetting that Trump's shotgun has two barrels. One of them contained the tariffs, the second one, the tax cuts. The second has not been fired yet. And I think this is a very important part of their plan for attracting foreign capital, particular German capital or Japanese capital or Taiwanese capital into the United States. But yes, look, you have every reason to be despondent about the lack of preparation, the chaotic nature of all these announcements, the very sloppy language that Donald Trump in particular uses. Reciprocal tariffs. There's no reciprocity in what he's doing. He's just going all out with gigantic tariffs in proportion to the trade deficit that the United States has vis-a-vis particular countries. So yes, I mean, it is a bit, you will excuse my unscientific term, it's a bit of a shit show. But then again, I have to take you back to 1971. It was exactly that in 1970. You know, Richard Nixon was not the most coherent or reasonable people in the world, right? He was probably one of the worst ones. He also, on the 15th of August, what we tend to forget is that not only did he uncouple the United States dollar from gold and spearheaded a massive devaluation of the dollar, but he also did something else. He introduced tariffs, 10% tariffs, immediately, the same day. And then he took those back 3 months later. So that's why I keep insisting that we've seen this play before. And we have seen the chaos, and we have seen how remarkably it worked, not on behalf of the working class of the United States, of the middle class of the United States. They were destroyed. I mean, as you know, in your country, hourly real wages are still below the level that they used to be at in 1973. When Trump talks about the carnage in the heartlands of the United States, he's completely right. Of course, he uses this to exploit the people who vote for him and trust him. And I think they trust him in a manner which they will live to regret one at some point. But we've seen all this before. Now, let's get to the point. Is this going to work or not? Well, I don't think it's going to work. I think that it's not going to work from the perspective of the MAGA base who put their trust in Trump to bring back a sufficient number of jobs and a quality of jobs that would somehow restore their capacity to dream the American dream. And the reason is not that capital is not going to rush to the United States. I have no doubt that it is already rushing into the United States. I have spoken to people in Germany. I've spoken to people in France. I've spoken to people in Japan. And they are increasing very substantially the amount of investment they're going to be putting into the United States. That is not the problem. Capital is flowing already in the United States. But I don't think the number of jobs is going to be proportional to the amount of capital, because if you think about, take Apple, for instance. When Apple introduced manufacturing again in the United States some years ago, they built that factory that makes their laptops, the MacBook Pros, in somewhere near Austin, Texas. Well, the number of jobs was minuscule because of automation. So a lot of the new manufacturing capacity is going to create a jobless surge. So this is problem number one. But allow me to tell you what I think is the real danger that Trump should be thinking about, especially during the night, keeping him awake. If I were him, I would worry about success. Because if he is successful in bringing back manufacturing to the United States to the extent that he says that he will, which I don't think he will, but let's say that he does, then what happens? Then the trade deficit of the United States shrinks. But the trade deficit of the United States is the flip side of the massive rents extracted from the global economy by American rentiers. Because come to think of it, it is the American trade deficit which keeps German factories churning, Japanese factories and Chinese factories. And it is the dollars that these capitalists in Germany, Japan, and in China collect, which they accumulate, and then they bring it back to, or send it to New York, to Wall Street, to be recycled in the form of US government debt, treasuries, some equities, and a lot of real estate. So the reason why financial markets have been doing so well over the last 40 years or so, the reason why realtors like Trump have been amassing these gigantic rents for the last 40 years is the American trade deficit. So what happens when he eliminates it, if he succeeds in eliminating it? Well, he's going to have some really very cross rentiers, financiers, and realtors. His tribe are going to be livid with him. Can he sustain that, or will he choose to betray the working class that voted for him? I suspect it will be the latter. Two basic things. The first thing they want to do is they want to substantially devalue the dollar, while simultaneously, and that may sound like a paradox, but I don't believe it is, maintaining the exorbitant privilege, the so-called exorbitant privilege of the dollar, maintaining its hegemonic presence in the world economy. That's one of the, possibly the most significant goal. The second thing they are trying to do is essentially tie together the extent to which the Trump administration is going to assault its allies and foes with Trump's tariffs, to tie this in to the extent to which tariffs are going to be used. So use tariffs in order to enhance the penetration of the American military-industrial complex in other people's economies, and to calibrate that penetration by means of the tariffs. But the first task, which I mentioned, seems to be, judging by what Scott Bessent is saying, what Stephen Miran are saying, it seems to me the number one priority.
It seems to be working, right? And what would be the consequence if they do successfully devalue the dollar but maintain the hegemonic presence?
And can I also say, Yanis, especially in the context of Trump pulling back originally because of what he saw in the bond market, I think he said people were getting, quote, a little yippy. How does all of this fit together?
Well, there's no doubt that he got a scare. He felt that the Liz Truss moment may be coming his way, undoubtedly. So he stepped back, but he's going to step forward again in his usual shuffle. But allow me to just by the way, lest I am misunderstood, I'm not supporting the Trumpian project. But I do believe that those of us who are politically opposed to it, we have a duty to understand it and not to dismiss them as a bunch of Neanderthals, which is what most of the liberal establishment, to their detriment, I have to add, are doing. So, look, if you heard Scott Bessent at the IMF the other day, he was really very clear. He talked about the Bretton Woods institutions. He talked about the Nixon shock in 1971. And essentially what he was telling his audience was, and it's not an irrational perspective to present to the world. What he was saying was, look, folks, ever since we became a deficit country, at the end of the 1960s, by 1970, America was a deficit country. We achieved something quite spectacular. We managed to grow our hegemonic power in proportion to our trade deficit and our budget deficit. That has never happened before. No empire has managed to grow its power while going into the red. And the United States managed to do it at the expense of the American working class, at the expense of a very substantial portion of the American middle class, but we did it. And then he adds, I don't believe we can carry on doing it, because there is a limit beyond which trade deficits are not sustainable anymore. And you see, the success of the Nixon administration, the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, and so on and so forth, was that they managed to make other people's capitalists pay for the American deficits in a manner which violently enriched the American rentier class. But that gave rise, in the end, to an incongruity. If you look at the dollar world, the world out there, the economic sphere that is denominated in dollars, it is gigantic, and it has been growing since the 1970s. But the manufacturing capacity, the real material economy of the United States, on which this dollar world is parasitic, has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. So you have a huge parasite and a tiny little organism on which the big parasite is being parasitic to. Mm-hmm. So their concern is that this is becoming completely disproportional. They need to shrink the dollar world and increase the extent to which the American economy can manufacture stuff. This is what they want. So from their perspective, a devaluation of the dollar by around 30%, which is ballpark what they want, will restore something like an equilibrium, not an equilibrium, but it will take the whole gamut closer to an equilibrium. But they're very, very worried that this devaluation should not be allowed to diminish the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. And this is why they're playing hardball with China. This is why they're playing hardball with the Japanese. They're telling the Japanese, sell a chunk of your $1.2 trillion of savings, but don't buy Japanese yen, do not buy the euro, do not buy the Chinese yuan. We will tell you what to buy. So tariffs are in that context, in the context of Besant, they are a sideshow. They may be very high up the list of priorities of the great Donald, but not his economic team. His economic team is far more interested in what they call the rebalancing of the dollar paper money trail and the actual productive capacities of the United States. In 1971, 15th of August, those old enough can remember that because it was a shocking day. It was the day when effectively Nixon blew up the international monetary system that the United States had painstakingly put together at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. The golden age of American capitalism, of global capitalism, which was the 1950s and 60s, as we all know and remember. It was predicated, it was built on that monetary system. It was a remarkable system, come to think of it. It had, the anchor was the dollar. People say that it was the gold because indeed the United States guaranteed anyone with $35 an ounce of gold from Fort Knox. But that was a sideshow, it was more for show. The reality was that it was a monetary system predicated on the United States dollar, which was in fixed exchange rates, completely pegged to every other currency in Europe and in Japan, and the Japanese yen. For years, for decades, there were no fluctuations in exchange rates. Interest rates were stuck at around 4.5%, plus or minus 0.1, 0.2%. It was wonderfully boring, the whole financial establishment. Imagine, you never had to check the exchange rates or interest rates because for decades they were the same. And it was a golden era because what was the essence of the Bretton Woods system? It was that the United States exited the Second World War as the only creditor nation, as the only surplus nation, the only country with a large, gigantic trade surplus. It was the only country that was not in ashes after the Second World War. And the idea was to maintain those surpluses. The American administration would do whatever it took in order to dollarize Europe and Japan, essentially taking part of its surpluses, sending it to Europe and to Japan, either in the form of aid or loans, private loans, public loans, so that the Europeans and the Japanese would have enough dollars to purchase the American exports. And this worked brilliantly until the United States no longer had the surplus. And with typical bravado, Richard Nixon, it wasn't Nixon himself, there were some very interesting people around him. The Nixon team comprised Henry Kissinger, who was the national security advisor at the time, before he became the Secretary of State. It was John Connally, the former Texas governor, Democrat, who absconded and joined the Nixon administration and became the Treasury Secretary.
And he was shot next to Kennedy.
Yes, indeed. He was in the car when JFK was shot. And primarily, a young man called Paul Volcker, that no one knew at the time, who was the real brains of the Nixon shock. But the reason I'm mentioning that, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that, is the Nixon shock took place on the 15th of August 1971. It was major. Nixon sent Connally, his Treasury Secretary, to the Europeans, who were pulling their hair out because the dollar devalued so fast and essentially inflation and unemployment was coming the way of the Europeans as a result of that move by Nixon. And Connolly very arrogantly and aggressively looked at them with cynicism, I would say, and said to them, guys, the dollar is our currency, but from today, it is your problem. So when people say that, what Trump did is unprecedented, and never before has America treated its allies so badly, that's rubbish. They did it in 1971, and they kept doing it for years and years. And indeed, Paul Volcker, before he was appointed by Carter, chairman of the Fed, a couple of months before that, 1978, if I remember correctly, he gave a speech at the University of Warwick in England, which was remarkable, because there he outlined the plan. And the plan was, and I am quoting here verbatim because it's etched in my mind, this speech of his, he said, the United States has opted, for reasons of its own national interest, for the controlled disintegration of the world economy. Does this remind you of anything? This is 1978, the controlled disintegration, and the Japanese and the Europeans were pulling their hair out. So, but you see, it took 10 years, because it wasn't just the Nixon shock in 1971, it was the Carter administration that continued that by appointing that same man, Paul Volcker, to be the head of the Fed. And then Reagan continued it, and then Bush continued it, and Clinton continued it. So whether, this is my excuse for saying it's too early to judge whether the Trump shock is going to work, because the question is there going to be this continuity in implementing the basic idea which people like Scott Bessent are outlining?
There's no doubt that he will succeed in achieving his objectives to some extent, to some magnitude. Already, there are plans by Germans, by Japanese, even by some Chinese business people, to shift production to the United States. So there's going to be a flood of investment into the United States. There is going to be a reduction in the trade deficit of the United States. The question is, are the costs going to be greater than the benefits for Trump?
Right.
And allow me to say that I think from a political perspective, not so much from an economic perspective, Trump's greatest enemy, the thing that should keep him up at night with terrible nightmares, is the prospect of complete success. Because suppose he succeeds, I'm not saying he will, but suppose he succeeds beyond his own dreams to eliminate the trade deficit of the United States through these tactics. Let's say he doesn't, okay? He's going to have some very angry mates in the New York Stock Exchange and in the real estate market in Miami, in California, in Manhattan. Why? Because the trade deficit of the United States, as of the mid-1970s, to this day, has been operating as a huge vacuum cleaner that has been sucking the capital of the world, the profits of foreign capitalists, into New York and into the real estate markets of the United States. So if he eliminates the trade surplus, which is keeping the realtors and the financiers happy and plumb, he will have some very irate financiers and realtors knocking on his door. And he will have a terrible dilemma for him, delicious from my perspective, as one of his political enemies. He will have to choose whom to betray, the American working class that voted him in, or his mates in the financial and real estate sectors. I think you know what my guesses are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's actually sort of the perfect test of the true soul of MAGA, now that you put it that way, Yanis. Can you talk to us a little bit more about what the potential costs could be, not just to, the financial sector, but when you're mentioning the American working class, sort of the core politically, again, of the Trump base, economically, even if there's this flood of investments coming into the U.S., we get more manufacturing jobs and people benefit from that. What other consequences, negative consequences, could the working class in the United States see as a result of the agenda Trump laid out last night?
Well, the worst case scenario for the working class in the United States is if this capital influx into the United States produces very few good quality jobs, But his tax cuts, which are coming, they haven't come yet, but they will hit the ground at some point, massively boost the income and therefore the bargaining power of employers when the labor market is not particularly boosted by whatever capital floods into the United States. Then the hard-pressed and impoverished working class that voted for him are going to be very disappointed with him, and they're going to have essentially keep losing bargaining power and purchasing power like they have been since 1975, 1973. So that's the worst case scenario for the American working class. At the same time, it all depends. It's a system of equations, not just one equation in one unknown, because you have the tax cuts. Let's face it, American industry, for better or for worse, depends to a very large extent for its manufacturing output on intermediary inputs from countries, particularly China. So there will be a lot of blood on the floor in various workplaces and manufacturing plants in the United States.
Let's talk about Europe. The import tariff on EU goods to America, it was cut yesterday, remember, from 20% to 10% for 90 days. Still a 25% rate for aluminium and steel and cars. Where do we go from here, from a European perspective? Yanis Varoufakis is an economist and a former Minister of Finance in Greece. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask you, first of all, just for your interpretation of what we saw yesterday, that spectacular U-turn, the retreat by Donald Trump. What did you make of it?
Well, it's clear that he buckled under the pressure of the bond markets. It wasn't the bond vigilantes, as some say. It was the fact that so many of the players in the money markets, especially in the United States, had over-borrowed to bet on the markets over the last months or years, using US treasuries, American government bonds as collateral. And a lot of those trades had to unwind, so they had to sell them. There was a fire sale of bonds, and that spooked Trump, there's no doubt. So there was this U-turn. I wouldn't call it a spectacular one. What I think the headlines should be is that we have a full-on trade war between the United States and its main trading partner, which is China. Those tariffs are beyond belief. They are huge Chinese wars between now the United States and China. At the same time, as you mentioned, we have a remarkable new tariffs between the United States and the European Union. What I think we should take away from this is that the model, the business model on which the Eurozone, in particular the Eurozone, the European Union more generally, has been based upon, this is essentially the mercantilist economy of the European Union, which is so dependent on massive net exports to the United States. Well, that's over now. And the Europeans have to take account of that. They have to look into their own bosom to find out, what can they do to rebalance their own economy. And I very much fear that they're not doing that.
Okay, so just push that a bit further for us. If America needs to be taken out of the equation, or has taken itself out of the equation, what does that European compensation look like? You can't make up the space simply by trading more with each other in Europe, can you? Is it about looking for new markets elsewhere in the world and better trade deals there? How do you see that?
I don't agree with you. Europe, for 3 decades at least now, has been basing its business model on suppressing domestic demand within Europe. This was the policy of austerity, combined with a lot of money printing in order to keep buoyant the financial markets in Frankfurt and in Paris. And that has made German goods and Dutch goods rather competitive in the United States. There is a lot of room in Europe for increasing investment and therefore increasing demand, and being able to balance the economy so that, yes, I'm all in favor of trade with other jurisdictions, including the United States. But I'm not in favor of the model which is predicated on excessive net exports to the rest of the world, because that is like exporting deflationary forces to the rest of the world. That is destabilizing the rest of the world. And Europe has been a destabilizing force around the world.
Yeah, I suppose there will be those who would say that the austerity that you described was about trying to retain credibility with the markets and to keep the balance sheets of various countries, including the United Kingdom, in reasonably good health. But you would reject that. You would argue for something bolder.
I don't think that, firstly, the markets care very much on whether you are following beggar thy neighbor policies. The markets can be placated through austerity, there's no doubt about that. We've seen this in Greece. Look at the state of the Greek bond market, it's actually quite healthy, but of course the country is fading. The United Kingdom has more or less kept the markets happy, except for the Liz Truss episode. And yet, you have an unsustainable economy as it is, because you have this huge liquidity in the City of London. The City of London is quite happy with it. But that liquidity does not become productive investments. And this is why you have a large trade deficit, the current accounts deficit, which is constantly sucking energy out of the British. It was utterly predictable. He had staked out the territory that he was going to invade, and he has invaded it. And now we have to make sense of what he's trying to do. We have to avoid the project fear that's coming from the liberal establishment. They resemble headless chickens running around panicking, utterly incapable of understanding that the man has a plan. I personally loathe his plan, but to dismiss him as an inarticulate fool, which he may be, but dismiss his whole team as not knowing what they're doing, is a gross error, which I think they will live to regret it. And here I'm talking about the Democrats in the United States, I'm talking about Macron in France, I'm talking about Ursula von der Leyen. The responses have been catastrophically inane. And that is a major challenge for humanity, given that what Trump is doing is he's truly upending the monetary system as we've known it, and the global trading system as we've known it.
Can you flesh out that point? Because that's similar to what some of the hysterical analyses are saying, but you're saying it without the fear-mongering. So if you could flesh out a little bit about why it's true that this is upending the financial system, but it's also sort of, when you understand it, I guess, different than the hysterics suggest.
Well, absolutely. Look, it's totally not unprecedented. Richard Nixon, on the 15th of August, 1971, this was something I expanded upon in my article in Unheard, shocked the world in a way that Trump cannot even begin to imagine competing with. The Nixon shock was much more devastating than what Trump is doing. And he did upend the monetary system of the time, which the United States had painstakingly put together at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. This was the golden era of world capitalism between 1944 and 1971. The United States played this huge role in creating essentially a common currency area, a dollar zone, including Western Europe and Japan. And it was the pride and joy of the United States establishment and the European establishment. And Nixon blew it up. And he did it knowingly. Paul Volcker, who was a member of his advisory team in 1978, expounded on this. He said, you have a choice sometimes. Maintain the global order, or for your own purposes, pursuing your own national interest, proceed with a controlled disintegration of the world economy. That's a quotation, the controlled disintegration of the world economy. And indeed, and here's the delicious irony. If you look at the liberal establishment in Europe and the United States, what are they exactly lamenting? The passing of what world? It was the world that was created by the Nixon shock. So let us not pretend that this is unprecedented. It happened before. And what Trump's team is assuming, or this is their conviction, it is that the world needs another Nixon shock, this time they call it the Trump shock, in order to maintain American hegemony against the grain of the diminishing significance of the United States economy in the grander scheme of things. Now, whether he will succeed or not is another matter. Nixon succeeded at the great detriment of the American working class, at the great detriment of, to some extent, Japanese capitalism and Western Europe. Western Europe was, it took them 30 years to recover from a shock and to create the euro. The euro was the attempt of Europeans to respond to the Nixon shock.